Well, hello friends, and welcome to the tale of the Chiltern Woodland Whistler. Now, many years ago, and we are talking centuries now, in the Chiltern Hills around me now, there was a small village, and in this village, as you would normally find in a village, was a whole mix of a community. And in particular, there were two young teenage guys and a very fair maiden, fair lady, and both of these guys were in love with the same girl. Now, she had a favourite, and although the names are lost to history, I'm going to call the favourite Robin, and the other suitor was called Jack. Now, in this period, because there were no sort of cars, vans, lorries, no delivery system, it was horse and cart only. When people needed to build a house or a church or anything, they would use the local materials. And so today you can still see evidence of exactly this. The Chiltern Hills are dotted with quarries, because in the Chilterns you have the clay layer on the top, which contained clay and flint, and below that you have chalk and flint. And of course all of these materials were incredibly useful for building houses. Now, there was a bit of a building period going on in this house, in this village. It was in a growth period, and there was a quarry that they were using not far from the village. So the menfolk of the village were engaged in digging out of this quarry, and that included the two lads, Robin and Jack. Now, it was hard work and it was tiring work, but like a lot of these sort of jobs, it was fulfilling at the same time. And the men always used to look forward to lunch times, when the wives would come along with their lunch and, you know, partake of lunch with them and then travel back. Well, on this one particular day, the women of the village were joined by the fair maiden, who I haven't given a name, but let's call her Jessica. Now, Jessica came down with two lunch packs, one for Robin and one for Jack. So she gave Jack his lunch pack, and then she moved across and she sat with Robin, and she had her lunch with Robin. Now, of course, that was a massive signal back then of her intentions. She'd made a choice. She decided which of the two of them she wanted to be with, which of the two she wanted to marry. And of course there was much excitement about this, and Robin was clearly ecstatic and everyone was happy. Everyone, of course, except for Jack. Now, after lunch, the women went back as they did, and there was much gossiping and chat and, you know, happy chatter, and you could hear as the women walked away plans for the wedding that would happen the following summer were, you know, being made already and being talked about already. And the menfolk were happy, and they got on with their work, digging out these big flints and loading up the cart, ready to take back at the end of the day. And sure enough, the end of the day came. As I say, it was winter time, so the days were short, and they started to sort of pack their stuff away, and the cart was loaded, and they travelled back. But Robin made the decision that he wanted to dig out a bit more. He was a hard worker, was Robin, and he wanted to get a good start on the next morning. So the others left him to it in the woods. Now, unbeknown to the menfolk of the village, and indeed to Robin, who was still working in the pit, Jack had slipped away, and he'd doubled back on himself, and he'd come back to the quarry. Now, on arrival at the quarry, back at the quarry, he picked up a cast-off piece of flint that had fallen from the wagon earlier. And he crept up behind Robin, who was working away with a stick, with a pick, digging out a large lump of flint. Coming up behind him, Jack raised the flint up and smashed it down, hitting Robin cleanly on the head with great force. Well, Robin instantly fell to the floor. Big wound on his head, blood gushing everywhere. And Jack, who was so jealous of him, just came out of his kind of crazed mood, his crazed thing, and instantly thought, oh my God, what have I done? He'd killed Robin, and I didn't know what to do, just panicked. So he ran back to the village and concocted a story on his way, and said that he'd forgotten something at the quarry, and he'd gone back, and Robin had attacked him, and he did his best to fight him off, and he'd got injured, and the men of the village heard this and headed back with lanterns. As I say, it was winter time, it was getting dark. They headed back with lanterns, and whilst this was happening, whilst Robin had gone away, whilst Jack had gone away back to the village and concocted this story, Robin had come to, because the blow had knocked him unconscious. Indeed, as it was later discovered, it had fractured his skull, and he tried to call out for help, but try as he might, he couldn't get any words out of his mouth. There was no sound, and he had a blinding headache, and could barely see, because not only was it getting dim in the woodland, his eyesight was all blurred, all messed up. And of course, what we know now, but what Robin didn't know then, was that his skull had been fractured in such a place that it had pressed on the part of his brain responsible for speech, which was why he just couldn't get the words out, couldn't cry for help. But he stumbled to his feet and, finding his way as best he could, he was making his way back to the village. Now, even though Robin knew these woods, as indeed they all did, because it was their home, it was their local area, they knew it better than anything. Although he knew the woods perfectly, in his confused state, half blind, unable to call out, stumbling, having lost blood, he got turned around in the woods and he couldn't work out where he was. And meanwhile, the men from the village had made it back to the quarry site. And there, well, where Jack expected Robin to be laying dead, there was nobody there. But what there was there was a large lump of flint covered in blood. Now, flint on the outside of it before it's now is white, and that blood stood out a mile. And immediately the men started to question, was it a fight? This doesn't sound like a fight. It doesn't look like a fight. That's a weapon. It's not two lads having a scrap. So they were unsure. I mean, Jack didn't have a scratch on him, even though Robin was the stronger of the two boys. Jack didn't have a scratch. So they weren't sure. But they knew, because Robin wasn't there, he was somewhere. So they started to search for him. Now Robin, in his confused state, had slumped at the base of an elder tree, just like I'm sat here now, at the base of an elder, and he'd slumped against it. Now, one thing he knew about elder was, even though he couldn't speak, he could call for help using the elder. So he pulled out his pocket knife and, cutting away at a young piece of elder, he made the cuts he needed, and then, fashioning himself a small whistle, he put that to his lips and blew. And using the last of his energies, he kept this whistle in his lips, and in time with his breathing, back in the quarry, the men heard the sound of the whistle, the constant sound of the whistle, slowly but surely coming through the woodland towards them. So, gathering up all their lanterns, they headed out in search of the sound, which they knew must have come from Robin. Well, they got closer and closer to the sound, and yet all the time it seemed like they weren't getting closer. They knew they must be nearby, but the sound was growing fainter and fainter. as Robin's breath was failing him. But suddenly, one of the men cried out, found him, slumped against the elder with the whistle on his lips. Blood dried down his face, down his body. And in the lantern light, he could see that it had that very, very serious head wound. And all the men gathered round, including, at the back of the group, Jack. With the very, very last of his energy and his strength, he raised his hand, and seeing through the mist in front of his eyes, he pointed directly at Jack. Jack was immediately seized by the men. Robin slumped back, whistle still in his lips, and he died there and then against that tree. Now Jack made a full confession of his crime and was cast out from the village, taken away, and eventually he was hanged. There was no wedding. There was no happy ending. Jessica ended her days a spinster. But if we fast forward, and this is where the Chiltern Whistler bit comes in, we fast forward in time over 100 years to when the Bodgers were working these Chiltern woodlands. There was talk and tell, very occasionally, on winter nights, just as they were closing up and heading out of the woods to go home, they would hear and they knew that that night, that woodland was not a nice place to be. Thanks for just taking the time to sit and hear the tale of the Woodland Whistler.